Thank you. So we are now done with the questions.
Francis, no questions?
No.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I have enough to do just trying to run this thing. It's been 15 years, a little rusty. So the next item, the next part of this is for us to discuss. We're not going to be asking any questions. We are simply going to go down the line, express our views and our thoughts. When we're done, I'll see if anybody wants to make a motion. So we'll see where we go. Mr. Jacques?
Oh, we got to push the,
Sorry.
pass the mic, sorry. We've been using that one.
So one of the things that has been talked about is the validity of a demographer's report. If you look back over history, demographers generally don't do a very good job in predicting reality. They come up with numbers, and I don't think that the record, I have no idea whether you've used the same demographer or different providers over the years, but it doesn't appear that they have the best record. I'm also not convinced that there are, as you say, thousands of apartments about to be built. I think there is clearly a lot of development going on, but I would also challenge the thought that these are all going to be or there's going to be a significant number of families with young kids, because as we've seen within the Bay Area, the South Bay generally, few people can afford to move into Los Altos, Mountain View, Palo Alto, Menlo Park, you name the city, and send their kids to school here. It's just an unfortunate fact of life. And I do think that the development that is happening north of El Camino is going to, I think one of the speakers mentioned, multi-million-dollar apartments. I think they are going to be a little bit more on the higher end side rather than anything which is going to be affordable. So, I do question whether we're going to see the population growth and the enrollment growth within that area. Having said that, there clearly is a need, and I have separately spoken to people that live in that, particularly that live in the crossings. I know that there is a lot of interest in having a neighborhood school in that area, and I think that's something that is certainly worth looking at. That's about my only comment right now.
Thank you. Ms. Waterman Roy?
I just want to thank you guys again for coming and lasting through a lot of questions. I think we appreciate having a chance to have a lot of the questions that we may have been thinking about. Excited to have a chance to actually ask you and talk to you instead of sort of just having communication go sort of vicariously through newspapers or other venues. So I just appreciate that. I appreciate the commitment to finding a permanent facility for Bullis for the BCS community, and I hear that and respect that and appreciate your commitment to that. Also appreciate the fact that you guys have to consider the needs of all the students in your district and thinking about the communities of the existing schools as well. It's not an easy job, and so I appreciate you're trying to balance different needs. And I think starting this kind of a conversation allows a little bit more of a dialogue, and for me, certainly understanding a bit more of perspective for how you're approaching it or other community members not in the Bullis community, as well as our Bullis community. So it's given me a lot of food for thought tonight. I guess I do, like David, still have some concerns about the enrollment growth and the likelihood that there really is a significant amount of enrollment growth that couldn't be managed within the existing capacity of the schools. And without that, it does seem to me that as a taxpayer, I'd want to be spending my money on building facilities and renovating if I'm building facilities, build them using what land we have already rather than new land purchase, and then having more money available to meet the facilities needs of existing schools as well, rather than sort of have it all end up going towards buying a 10th site and building a site, whether that's for Bullis or elsewhere. But I think I'm interested in exploring some more data and understanding that a little better. The other thing that I'd say is I really would hope that as we move forward, I appreciate that the interest in dialogue and the interest in understanding what the Bullis community's needs are, so that we can plan effectively. And I do hope that as we move forward, it can continue to be a dialogue, particularly if whatever site we end up in, whether it's a tent site, whether it's an existing site, whether it's short-term, long-term, it's really helpful to actually feel like partners in designing and understanding the use of that space. And I think sometimes my experience limited on the board has been sometimes it hasn't felt like a partnership. It's been felt more like, tell us the numbers and then we'll go and figure it out. And I may be overgeneralizing. I haven't been directly in the conversations, but if that's a perception, I think it'll do a lot as in terms of our relationship working together to be able to make it a dialogue. We're really seeing the district continuing to ask and really engage in the design process or in the setting up process for whatever the new facilities are. I think that will do a lot to build trust and trust between the two communities as we try to move forward in finding good long-term facilities, short and long-term facilities. So I'll leave my comments at that, but thank you.
Ms. Eyring?
Thank you. So I do appreciate the challenges of redrawing district boundaries. I was on the Bullis Purissima Elementary School PTA board the year it closed. I was on the Covington PTA board the year it opened, when nobody else would sign up to be a part of it. I understand the challenges. I also understand the challenges that BCS has faced with insufficient space to do the things that it needs to do. I also understand the challenges financially of being spread across two sites and asking our staff to be running back and forth. We agreed to that in a 5-year deal because we saw the value in having an agreement with you, but it was a 5-year deal with the understanding that we would be looking at moving into permanent facilities at this time. From a parent point of view, my students are graduated and out, so it isn't a personal issue. It's an issue of making sure that the needs of the community are met. I'm very concerned about how little planning and thought has been put into the site. Your architect, Gelfand, did a drawing about 3 years ago as part of the facilities master planning process to design a 650 student K-8 facility, and it was 14 acres in space. BCS is already well over 900 students now, so looking at a 9-acre site has me very concerned. K-8 facilities are more complex because you actually have to have different types of facilities for kindergartners as different grades. So it isn't, you brought up the Hillview School, which I think it's Hillview, that's up in Menlo Park. It's great, except it's a middle school. All the students have the same needs. It's different when you have students of a lot of different grades. I also have concerns about the demographers' numbers. When we sat down 4.5 years ago, or 4 years ago, we both agreed on student projection numbers. And BCS is slightly over their 900 students, and LASD, as of last year, was over 500 students below those numbers. More than a full school, I'm assuming, but I haven't seen the numbers for this year, but the demographer last spring said they were expecting less kindergartners, so I'm guessing it is further down this year. I'm interested to see that. I'm also concerned that you bring up how it's such a concern to disrupt students and their location. Well, BCS, while you don't call it a permanent site, it is a permanent site. It is where my students spent their entire K through 8 years. So I think moving BCS should be equally as important as considering moving of any other LASD school. I'm also very concerned about the conversations that you're looking long-term. I don't think when we looked at Measure N, we were talking long-term. We were talking short-term, meeting the needs of the short-term needs. And I'm very concerned about all this discussion being so long-term. Well, if you need a site for a neighborhood north of El Camino, then why is there any conversation about putting BCS there? BCS draws across the entire community. It's far too large to fit on that site. It has students coming from every school in the district, with only a little bit smaller in the Oak and Santa Rita and Springer, but across the other schools, a lot of students. And so it makes no sense to be putting it on the edge of the district.
Thank you. Mr. Ying?
Pass this one down. Thank you.
Oops.
Yes, I too want to thank you guys for coming in. I know it's not easy, and I know it took a lot of time, but it's an important issue. And I hope we can work together on a sort of a collaborative solution, right? Because it's such an important issue for our community. But I do feel that a lot of the other or some of the alternatives haven't been adequately vetted. You know, they say that the devil is in the details. I mean, this is, I applaud you for trying to structure such a complicated transaction. And I know that the market is probably not doing you any favors right now. But the devil is really in the details. As I mentioned, you know, the TDR risk, right? There's a funding liability or counterparty risk with the TDRs. The party involves the transaction involves three different parties, right? You, a public REIT, federal, and Greystar, a private developer, along with the city. There are other counterparty risks, such as if, in fact, the city does approve a funding agreement for contributing its park and lieu funds, there will be conditions that potentially may be attached to that funding agreement, such as what if there was a neighborhood preference put on that funding agreement? Short of you operating your own school, that obligation needs to be fulfilled by potentially a third party. And that's an obligation with you because the funding agreement would be between you and the city. So short of operating an LASD school there, that would be a difficult obligation to fulfill. And I know it's premature at this point to go through a lot of the project scoping, design scoping, programming of what the school will look like, how to size it, what's actually going to be built. But as any private developer will tell you, before you buy, you know, potentially a $100+ million piece of land, you better have a pretty good idea of what you're going to do, right? That's all part of the underwriting process. And so I feel that LASD, as stewards of our public tax dollars, it would be prudent, fiscally prudent, to go through some of that project scoping now. As I mentioned, it's for you guys to be successful. I'd hate for you guys to buy the 10th site and then not adequately scope and budget for what you want to build, i.e. designing to a budget, and you end up budgeting to a design and having a budget bust before you even put a shovel in the ground. So, and lastly, I also echo David's comments. North of El Camino, I feel that given the high cost of construction, which continues to go up, year over year for the past 2 years, there's been 15% increases in construction costs, and there doesn't seem to be any abatement or pricing relief in sight. And the high cost of land, as you guys well know, right? That for a developer to buy and build a project, you're talking about rents north of El Camino that are north of $6 per square foot per month. There's not a lot of families being formed. And that's true in speaking with the Prometheuses and Carmel Partners and Greystar and Anton and all those guys, right? You look at their average square footages for a 2-bedroom and a 1-bedroom, they're not conducive to family formation. I know the city wants a higher unit mix for 3 bedrooms, but the reality is developers don't like to build 3 bedrooms. They don't pencil. They like to build 1s and 2s. And so I too echo kind of David's concerns about you know, the validity of the family formation north of El Camino. I know there are a lot of units that have been approved, but given the cost of construction, and this is not just north of El Camino, but in the Bay Area specifically, there are projects left and right that are not getting built, even though they've been approved, because the cost of construction is so high, and they're so much higher that they've outpaced the rent growth. And so these units are not getting built. There's a handful of, I can name off, you know, a couple in the city that developers are not going ahead with. There are a number of developments here in the valley that developers are not going ahead with because construction costs just continue to spiral, right? They just continue to grow. So, so I guess what I would say is I'd really feel that that's behoove you guys to kind of go through, you know, even a conceptual budgeting exercise before you buy the land, because it's only wise.
Thank you. Mr. Bryan?
Thanks, Rich. Excuse me. Yes, I just want to echo a lot of what actually Ann said earlier. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I know it's a lot of time and probably not easy sitting there facing all of us in the audience and all the questions. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Yeah, for me, you know, there's something that I think maybe Vladimir, you said earlier that really resonated with me, and I really appreciate a lot of your comments and insights. I think it really brought to light for me that there's obviously two sides to this coin and a lot of considerations at play. You mentioned something earlier around the focus being on the kids, and the focus being on the kids very early on in your presentation, and that really resonated for me because I think sometimes people lose sight of that, and ultimately we are here for the education of our kids. Yeah, the only ask for me really is, you know, like I said, this has been insightful for me. There's been a lot of questions. There's been a lot of answers. And from those questions, I think there are more questions that we'll need to answer both within, you know, our board and yours. And I just hope that we can work together more deeply moving forward. I think hopefully this is the first of many meetings between our parties that we can be as transparent to the extent that we can, of course, and work together to the solution. So thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Roa?
Thank you also for me. And, you know, I was thinking of a question Bryan asked at some point during the presentation. I think when we were trying to understand timeline and how the design is going to look, and I know there are a lot of unknowns. But, you know, one of the questions you asked, and, you know, one of the reasons why you're here and we're having these conversations is because you would like to know if we're interested in occupying that side or not, right? And it is, you know, very difficult to answer that question, at least from my perspective. There is a lot of unknown. I mean, we don't know how many children could fit in a site. We don't know what the CEQA study is going to say. We don't know, you know, if the deal can fall through, right? There are so many unknowns that I think is it is a very difficult a question to answer with very little information. So I think there's room for a lot more details about the plans. And at the same time, and you also mentioned the presentation on September 24th with the options, right? What is the plan B, which has been my first question all along, is what happens if this doesn't happen, right? And again, I see some data there and options, but with very little information about budget, about costs, about what are the real plans. And I think it would be very difficult for this board and probably for members of the LASD community to make a decision with so very little information. But I'm also impressed by the fact that you have tried to reach out to the community, get information from people, and that you're here today. I think that's a great step forward for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Suttcliffe?
I'm going to be brief because I'm actually going to echo a lot of the things that have already been said. So I'll try to be very short. And I want to echo something that Claire was mentioning as well as Rich. And I'm not a developer, but I was concerned, one of my concerns would be that making such a large deal without actually having, like tonight I didn't hear like how many students could be on that piece of land, or how big would the school be, or we don't know yet who's going to be there. So that was a concern for me about having such a large deal and purchasing more land without actually knowing how many kids we would actually put on there. I'm a person who would want to systematically think about what am I using this land for who, for how many, as I tried to make those decisions about is this the best choice. So that was a concern for me. And then, but people have talked tonight about the possibility that BCS would be at this 10th site. So I just want to emphasize, again, for both boards and everyone involved, the importance of engaging the community north of El Camino, because I'm actually very concerned that the community north of El Camino may be misled and then very upset, rightly so, if they are expecting a neighborhood school after this piece of land is purchased. Because if BCS is housed at this site, that's not a neighborhood school. And so I'm concerned that they may be misled in thinking that if this site is purchased, they're going to get a neighborhood school. So I have a big concern about misleading that community and making sure that community is engaged with this decision about whether or not this site is purchased. Traffic was discussed tonight. That's another thing I'm really concerned about because if there was more than 900 plus students of BCS families traveling to north of El Camino, and then all the El Camino families traveling south to LASD schools, I just can imagine those intersections and people traveling in two different directions. So I just have a lot of concerns about who's going to be there and the congestion and whether there is a definite plan, whether we know who's going to be there, because I wouldn't purchase a piece of land myself unless I knew what I was going to do with it. Those are my comments.
Thank you. Joe, you're up. Mr. Hurd?
Thank you, Francis. I'm going to yield my time. I know that there are a number of things we have on the agenda, but before I sign off, I did want to thank Vladamir and Bryan personally for coming to spend some time with us tonight. As I told Vladamir in an email, I think a long journey starts with the first step, and hopefully I look forward to many more steps, many more conversations, many more questions getting answered, and a lot more information being provided to the community so that we can all come to the best decision for all of the students in LASD. So thanks to the two of you for coming, and I really do appreciate you spending time with us tonight. That's it.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I had actually come into this meeting planning to not ask any questions or make any comments. And that was, I said that last meeting, just in the interest of making sure that we got out a little bit earlier. So it was, not a reaction to what you said. We have a great board up here, and I trusted them to ask the right questions and make the right comments. So we are done with this item. There are some who may have wanted to speak, and they got here too late to turn in blue slips. If you want to add an additional comment, I'm not asking for those comments now. No, that would be a violation of the rules. But feel free to submit something that can be read within 3 minutes. Just send it up here, and if you give it to us, it becomes part of the public record too. So, I invite you to do that. But we are done with this item, and we're going to have a slight change in our order. We have Council Member Margaret Abikoa of Mountain View, who needs to get home, and our next presenter has graciously, Ms. Jean has graciously offered to wait a little bit later, and so we're going to go through the same process.